There is something inherently comedic about the fact that every game in Telltale's The Walking Dead series requires you to navigate raising a child during the zombie apocalypse, when its fan base infamously despises children. With the exception of Clementine, and later AJ, almost every child and teenage character, regardless of the season, is loathed to the extent that for years, there were significant numbers that would leap at the first possible opportunity to rid your group of them. In the best of circumstances, the characters were viewed as pesky annoyances, and in the worst, you had players that openly delighted in mistreating them. The reasons for this intense dislike vary drastically character to character, but typically boil down to them acting in accordance with their age, children being children, whereas AJ and Clementine by contrast are heralded as what a child in the apocalypse ideally ought to be, a miniature adult. It's not particularly surprising, especially given that children in apocalyptic stories are often presented more so as cumbersome and whiny burdens, walking liabilities that never listen to the well-intentioned advice they are given and do irreparable damage as a result. But this isn't the way that I feel any of the Walking Dead children are written. While there are few that harbor AJ and Clementine's keenly attuned survival instincts, each is written as a complex, unique character with a distinct and logical rationale behind why they behave the way they do. Yet it seems that in the grand scheme of the narrative, that doesn't matter so much as the feeling they leave the audiences with. And it's a mindset that I feel robs people of what I believe to be these children's most intriguing qualities. The fact that each provides you, as the player, an essential tip on what to do to better ensure the success of your own characters. What is often overlooked is the fact that with each child comes a crucial lesson on what exactly enables a child to learn to survive the impossible, one that you're then encouraged to incorporate into your own rearing. So, without further ado, let's discuss each. Before we begin, it's worth mentioning what exactly distinguishes Clementine from the characters that will be mentioned, and from almost every apocalyptic child sidekick ever written. A little-known fact is that Clementine was almost cut from the game outright due to fears players would want to abandon her or be angered by having to accompany her. So every aspect of her design is specifically intended to endear you to her. Take into consideration the scene in which she is first introduced to the player. She is obviously frightened, as nearly any child would be in the situation that she's in, but is pragmatic and empathetic to the extent that she is able to overcome her fear to help a man whose life is clearly in danger. She's resourceful enough to provide you something that will defeat the enemy that you're grappling with, and isn't unnecessarily hostile when you propose tips that'll better facilitate her survival. And while she doesn't always perfectly adhere to your advice, she takes the bulk of the lessons that are imparted upon her to heart. However, upon examining her in comparison to the other child characters of The Walking Dead, I find these children also usually harbor this same willingness to learn. It's just that they're hindered by the people that ought to be teaching them. When examining the most heavily disliked child characters, the characters that come to mind first are Duck, Ben, Sarah, and Ten. And of all these overhated characters, the one that I feel is most unjustly slandered is Sarah, a sweet-natured but anxious 15-year-old girl that is constantly criticized for being a liability. Despite the fact that she is shown to be capable of surviving on her own, she's just sabotaged by the people that should be encouraging her to do just that. Despite being 15, Sarah both acts and is treated as being considerably younger than Clementine, who, at the point that she meets her, is 11. The in-game explanation for this discrepancy being that her father Carlos believes that should Sarah understand the reality of their circumstances, her mind would cease to function. He views her as fragile to the extent that he will openly reprimand Clementine for attempting to educate her on the reality of their world and circumstances. And yet, in the event that you ignore her father's advice and choose to be truthful with her, Sarah is shown to be capable of handling it. For instance, should you tell her another member of your group has passed away, Sarah will need a moment to process her pain and shock, but will ultimately be able to come back together on her own. She doesn't collapse in a heap, she doesn't burst into tears, she doesn't go totally catatonic. She just takes a moment to mourn before continuing to carry on with her life, indicating that she is not nearly as emotionally fragile and naive as her father believes her to be. And should you show her trust where no one else does, you'll discover that Sarah wants more than to understand the reality of the post-apocalyptic world. She wants to learn to survive within it, and openly views you as an opportunity to learn. And when opportunities to learn present themselves, instead of seeking out her father or any other member of her group, she instead seeks out Clementine. This is somebody that wants to try and pull their own weight, that wants to be as useful as possible in the setting they're in, that wants to be viewed as capable of handling the truth. The players that loathe her will likely still pose the argument that Sarah's willingness to learn doesn't matter so much as her capability to survive, which, unfortunately, proves to be next to non-existent in the moments it matters most. However, Sarah's inability to survive is narratively intended to serve as a callback to the Stranger of Season 1, revealing that in the event that you had left Clementine with him, his philosophy, the same as Carlos's, would have killed her. If we take a moment and recall the Stranger's backstory, we learn that he loses his 2 children in attempting to teach them to survive. His son goes missing as he attempts to learn to hunt, and in attempting to locate his son, his family leaves the van they were living out of unattended, the van that you happened to rob earlier on in the game. The loss of their son and supplies ultimately proves to be too much for the Stranger's wife to handle, with her abandoning him and taking their daughter along with her. only for the pair to perish on their own shortly thereafter. Setting aside the bloodthirsty hunger for vengeance this event spawns, it's one that fundamentally warps the way the stranger believes children ought to be interacted with. Amidst his other determinant criticisms, the stranger will always without fail criticize you for making a survivor of Clementine, perceiving you as the person that has and is actively robbing her of the innocence that ought to define this period of her life. In his grief, he wrongfully perceives his attempts to prepare his son to survive within the world they currently inhabit as being the thing that caused his death, rather than viewing that death as the byproduct of a natural and tragic risk existing within their world poses. In his eyes, if he'd allowed his child to remain a child a while longer, none of this would have ever happened. But we see with Sarah what happens when you force a child to cling to a life they can no longer have, with her father's overprotectiveness stunting her in the areas that she theoretically should have had the opportunity to flourish within. It's not just her father at fault, though. When Clementine and Sarah are first introduced to each other, the adults that surround Sarah seem to insinuate there's something deeper going on with her. Although the answer that we're given in game is her being an overly anxious, sensitive child, a significant amount of players speculate a potential developmental disorder, like autism. This subtle implication that Sarah may have a neurodevelopmental disorder or more extreme mental illness sheds extra light on why every member of her group is so insistent on shielding her from the world, as I've met a tremendous number of parents that share this mindset in pre-apocalyptic times. There is an incredibly specific type of special needs parent that interprets their child's special needs as their child's complete and utter inability to do anything on their own till the end of time. Now, let's note that this type of parent, like Carlos, is rarely malicious in their intent, but their good intentions do not mitigate the fact the damage they deal their children is still extreme. They are more often than not so preoccupied with preserving this worldview that their child is incapable and helpless they often neglect signs their child has abilities beyond what they believe them to have, even sometimes going so far as to sabotage opportunities their child receives to demonstrate their own learning and understanding. Carlos is a phenomenal example of such a parent. But to extend a potential olive branch, it'd be understandable if Carlos became this overprotective after the apocalypse. The world goes up in flames around you, and you desperately want to cling to your little girl, something nobody would ever fault a father for. However, judging by Sarah's mannerisms and habits, we can deduce that this has been happening for far longer. Think of the fact that players often mistake Clementine and Sarah as being the same age when Sarah is 4 years older, which to me gives me the impression that her ability to access the outside world pre-apocalypse was so heavily restricted she now seems almost stunted. This is a girl that was being set up for catastrophic failure pre-apocalypse, and yet, rather than reassess his parental approach, Carlos doubles further down on it, as does the rest of the group, even in circumstances where not having the knowledge that she needs to survive endangers his daughter's life. It's no wonder Sarah freezes up in moments of immense stress. Wouldn't you, had you been prevented from properly navigating your own problems your entire life? Yet it's worth noting that even in the instances where she cowers, Sarah still exhibits a tremendous amount of bravery, and there is no better example of this than the scene in which Carver slaps Clementine. At this point in the story, Carver is the most significant human threat Clementine and Sarah have ever encountered. A man that's murdered innocents, beaten Sarah's father to a bloody pulp, and raped Rebecca. A man the members of their group fear to the extent they tremble at just his name. And yet, although Sarah is just as aware of this information as the rest of them, she cares for Clementine to the extent that when Carver slaps her hard enough to knock her down, she'll defend her, even after having been hurt at Carter's hands once herself. So if Sarah exhibits both the bravery to challenge threats and the ability to handle painful knowledge, why then does her father feel compelled to keep her in the dark? If this is not being done for the sake of the child, then who is this being done for? The answer is almost painfully simple: the parent. Carlos is understandably terrified that should his daughter have full reign of the world, she will be harmed due to her differences. But what Carlos fails to properly take into account is the fact that children that he would have deemed capable are harmed every day. Depriving his daughter of the opportunity to get hurt will not prevent her from ever being harmed. It will simply render the circumstances so that she will have no idea on how to heal or recover when she inevitably is. What it does successfully do is prevent Carlos from having to confront a painful reality, and shield him and his emotions slightly longer. Although not done nearly to the same extreme, we see traces of the same line of thought in the way that Kenny and Katya interact with Duck. Unlike Sarah, the bulk of Duck's fan hate has always resided in the fact that Duck is a child that, shockingly, acts like a child. He's rambunctious, hyperactive, and doesn't always fully grasp the gravity of the situation or anticipate the consequences of his own actions. His nickname, Duck, stems from the fact that little phases him, and that any hardship that he encounters, at least to him, is merely water off a duck's back. Kenny affectionately brands him as being dumber than a bag of hammers on account of this naivety, with him and his wife Katya seeming fixed on preserving this naivety for the sake of maintaining a semblance of Duck's childhood innocence over dispatching it for the sake of survival. The thing is, innocence is not ignorance, and ignorance is not stupidity. At the point that Duck is bitten, despite his parents' efforts to shield him, he already has accidentally caused the death of Sean Green, whom he was incredibly fond of, unknowingly eaten the legs of Mark, another member of his group that he and his family were already well acquainted with, had a shotgun held to his head and been attacked on numerous occasions. The world that he and his family inhabit is an inherently traumatizing one, and nothing they do will insulate him from its ferocity or harsh cruelty. Although these are all extremely negative experiences, downplaying their severity will not wash away their impact. All it will do is hinder Duck from being able to process them properly. It's not that Kenny and Katya should have framed all these scenarios as something Duck ought to have fixated on, but reflecting on them would have provided him insight on how to better navigate these new circumstances, and prevented him from potentially growing totally numb to new danger. Should you provide Duck the opportunity, he'll prove he can even be quite the useful asset. As you are investigating the missing medical supplies in your camp, Duck will offer his services to you as your trusty sidekick, and show that he can actually be well attuned to his surroundings should the situation call for such. It's a short gameplay segment, but it's one that affirms that Duck wants essentially what all small children want: to be helpful. Children love when they feel as though they can make significant, meaningful contributions, and are typically far more attuned to their circumstances than most parents may initially realize. Duck is no exception, and Duck, like Sarah, like Clementine, is a child that needs to be provided the tools they need to adapt to progress further. Make no mistake, Duck ultimately dies due to a freak accident that he realistically had no control over, and that his parents likely would not have been able to prevent. But there are still a handful of lines that insinuate that had he potentially survived, he risked heading down a similar path. A significant conflict between Katya and Kenny, and frankly the rest of the group, is the fact that all members walk around armed, with Katya viewing this as a sign they've surrendered their humanity over an action undertaken to better increase their chances of survival. While it would be understandable for Katya to oppose a deliberate act of violence, it seems that she conflates the desire to protect oneself with that, meaning it would be unlikely for her to want to allow Duck any lessons on how to operate a firearm, or learn appropriate forms of self-defense. This, coupled with an unwillingness to bolster their child's maturity, is an incredible recipe for disaster, their demise ultimately being the big catalyst that motivates Lee to teach Clementine to defend herself. So you see what happens when you deprive a child of the crucial know-how and skills they need to navigate the world for the sake of preserving a rather abstract idea of innocence. But what happens when you flock to the opposite side of the spectrum, and thrust a child into the world to face it head-on with no warning whatsoever? You'll receive Ben. Ben is easily among the most detested characters of Season 1, a boy that's best remembered as remarkably frustrating, and worst as somebody that destroys quite literally everything they touch. And yet, Ben is never provided the opportunity to be anything but a colossal screw-up. Ben is a character that feels as though he is almost intentionally designed to be as infuriating to the player as possible, in large part because Ben acts in the way the majority of people would in a true apocalypse scenario. We glorify Rick Grimes and Lee Everett, but if we're being realistic, should a true apocalypse ever arise, we'd be faced with significantly more Bens. People that harbor no ill will or intentions but find themselves overwhelmed by their terror more often than not. People that want badly to be an asset but lack the life experience and skill to make true meaningful change. There's a common misconception in the games that Ben is in college, when in reality, he's in high school. He, like the other members of his party, has lost everything, but unlike the other members of his party, has no context as to what happened to his loved ones. Although Ben also desperately needs a guiding figure, he doesn't have one, in large part because the other members of his group view him as being at an age where he automatically should be self-reliant. This deprivation forces him to rely exclusively on his own exceptionally poor judgment, and he is frequently condemned for doing so. But think of your own judgment at 16. Do you believe you'd be able to anticipate the consequences of your every move when under extreme stress when up until this point you've had a knowing, authoritative figurehead to guide your footsteps? Do you believe you'd be able to soar if you were never even taught how to fly? Ben's plight is one met with remarkably little sympathy from both players and the other members of Ben's group, with them perceiving him as something more akin to a man than as the boy that he truly is. Players will often quip that Clementine, at the age of 8, makes a more well-equipped survivor. But Clementine actually has a person invested in her well-being, whereas Ben is near universally despised. Although shame is often viewed as being the best possible tool to motivate change, being relentlessly bombarded will more often than not reinforce the behaviors that you're attempting to dispel. And in the instance of Ben, the barrage that he's subjected to actually makes his most harmful behaviors worse. He, like many teenagers, is treated like the stupidest possible iteration of a child while being expected to conduct themselves like an experienced adult. And in the event that he does not know what the latter looks like and cannot emulate them, his naivety is treated as being akin to moral failure. This is not to say that Ben's worst actions, trading away food and other crucial supplies to bandits, abandoning Clem, are justifiable, but they are understandable and highly avoidable. If Ben had even had one person he felt he could genuinely confide his trust within, the former scenario had a high chance of not happening whatsoever. But unfortunately, people will reflect the way they are treated, and if they are treated as nothing but a burdensome liability, how can they hope to be anything but that? This is the plight 10 poses, an idealistic, deeply introspective child you meet within Season 4. Unlike almost every other person you've encountered so far, 10 views the Walkers as simply another frightful age humanity must endure, but inevitably will survive. He doesn't even regard the Walkers as pure monsters, taking care to emphasize the human beings they once were. He's a highly sensitive and sweet-natured young boy, one that bears no malice or ill intentions. And yet, aside from the outright villains of Season 4, 10 is easily the most hated character. 10's persistent belief a better world is possible and the innocence that he clings to are often seen as outright weakness, especially in a series where survival often depends on pragmatism and ruthless decision-making. 10's outlook and overall naivety is, in the eyes of both his peers and players, an outright liability, and to be totally fair, they're not exactly wrong. 10's idealism and inexperience often puts others at risk, with him frequently hesitating to fight or struggling to make the harsh decisions necessary for survival at the expense of others' lives. And yet, at the same time, how can 10 be something he was never demanded to be? Players will often tout AJ as the ideal survivalist, but all both are mere products of their environment. The schoolyard, the makeshift home and community for 10 and the other children, plays a significant role in shaping his worldview, with the well-meaning leaders of it fostering an environment that prioritizes the preservation of his innocence over preparing him for the harsh realities outside their walls. It's an understandable approach, given their desire to maintain some crude semblance of childhood and normalcy, but one at odds with the reality that Marlon intentionally deprives 10 of his two greatest sources of support and comfort, his sisters. And it's this isolation that arguably leaves 10 most inadequately prepared to cope with the brutal truths of the apocalypse, and unintentionally stunts his emotional development. At least a portion of this is attributable to the notion that preparing a child to handle reality and preserving their innocence are fundamentally incompatible. But that's not the case. 10's empathy and optimism doesn't have to be stomped out of him for him to learn how to fight, nor will him learning destroy his most human qualities. Clementine and AJ being the best possible examples of how to strike this balance. They're both keenly aware of the harshness that survival may occasionally depend on, but don't openly delight in the violence they must enact, and maintain a general sense of affection for their common man, although they approach them with caution. There's no reason 10 could not have become the same, and should he be allowed to survive, he'll learn. This is the overarching lesson that can be found in each of these characters, that the most important aspect of raising a well-adjusted child is balance. Children need both protection and exposure to reality, innocence and resilience, guidance and independence. While Clementine and AJ are often hailed as the ideal survivors, their development is the product of a blend of nurturing influences and harsh lessons, proving that even in a world as brutal as The Walking Dead's, it's possible to cultivate strength without sacrificing humanity. Each child, despite their flaws and the disdain they often attract, offers crucial insights into the complexities of surviving in an apocalyptic world, demonstrating that the ability to endure often comes from being extended both support and the opportunity to grow from their life experiences. Thank you so much for navigating the world of The Walking Dead with us, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And here's an extra special thank you to our Patreons. What we do would not be possible without your support. If you would like to count yourself among them, the link is in the description. Thank you so much for your time, and have a fabulous day.